today's Coaching Coordinator podcast, we're going to talk about quantifying things that you feel are important as a coach. And to help us uncover some of this and get into the details of it is former NFL player and CEO, founder of Breakaway Data, Dave Anderson. Dave, it's great to have you here on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk some ball. It's been too long. You talk too much data.
Well, I want to understand how you got to this point, that you got involved with, the data and the things that you're getting into. Obviously, you have a football career, spent some time in the NFL with a guest a past guest of the podcast was a QC guy there, just getting his start in Richmond Flowers. I'll link Richmond's podcast to this, but some great experiences both in college and the NFL, and I'm sure high school as well. So help us understand, I guess, the journey to this point in football that brought you here.
Sure. So I'm the love child of a engineer that could run fast with my dad, and a free spirit, my mom, out here in California. And I always had kind of both of those run through my blood. And that, growing up, I was certainly the son of an engineer and really good at math. And I was always kind of in the math mods and the math Olympics and the gate classes where I would go get, finish PE, run all sweaty and stinky. And then I'd go to some weird community college class and take a math class about four grades higher than mine. So I was always good at math and good at sports. Ended up going to Colorado State, playing football there. Skipped over some good schools to play real football, as I told my parents, with Sonny Lubick. That was back in the day with Colorado State Thursday night football. Cecil Sapp, Bradley Van Pelt. We were, beating the piss out of the rest of the Mountain West back then. Got drafted in 2006 after a good CSU career. That was the Mario Williams, Reggie Bush draft. It's crazy to think that was 15 years ago now. And played 6 seasons there basically. Last year and a half bounced around from the Texans, the Redskins, the Seahawks, back to the Texans, and then finished my with a cup of coffee on the Seahawks and Broncos. And while I was kind of finishing up my NFL days, started taking the GMAT and wanted to go back to school. Went back to school, got my MBA in data science from the USC Marshall School of Business out here. Did the whole 2-year full-time program with a humbling experience, to say the least. I thought I was a pretty smart guy in a locker room, and then I got into a business school class and realized I was quickly an idiot. I didn't know how to string together a sentence or how to write any papers or any of that stuff, but I was pretty good at manual labor. Having played football that whole time, but that didn't get me far in school. But what I did realize is my experience of having played on the field and my kind of ability to understand and communicate data could be a pretty unique offering. Brad Pitt had just finished Moneyball, and everyone was talking about Moneyball this, Moneyball that. All the teams were trying to get involved, and at the same time, luck would have it, there was an artificial intelligence company that came out of USC called Second Spectrum that is now the official tracking does all the official tracking for the NBA and the English Premier League. They were out of SC. I came across them on campus. They recruited me. That was my first job out of business school. It was working for eventually the biggest tracking company in sports. But it was just 6 of us working out of a Starbucks back then. And, that's kind of how my whole data analytics career started. And I think what I always tell people about tracking data, especially, is to oversimplify it, it measures space. And every sport, at the heart of every sport, is about creating or taking away space. Whether you're James Harden in a step back, creating space for a 3, whether you're a left tackle blocking a defensive end trying to create space for your quarterback, or whether you're Messi, who's going left right in order to get a little space to get off a shot. Every sport is about creating it or taking away, and with tracking data, it allows you to come up with some pretty cool measurements of ability. Before that, a statistic just tells you what happened. Dave scored 20 points or had 6 catches. But what you could now use with tracking data, say Dave had 6 catches while, being open less than 1 foot, or Dave scored 20 points while being wide open in corner threes. So it adds context to information. And That's kind of how my career started, is just like down that track on how can we use data to help communicate value to players, value to teams, and value to fans. And if you do that right, I think there's some pretty cool opportunities.
Yeah, and that's something that we see really coming to the forefront here, the analytics portion of this. Now, I know, in this particular audience, we've had a number of coaches come on and talk about the analytics that their teams use, right? Making decisions on when to go for two, or when to go for it on fourth down, or how many possessions are left in a game, et cetera. But you come at this from a different approach in helping build a team. You're looking at it from the individual athlete standpoint and collecting data that way. And I know, a lot of teams still, they do this. I can think back to, I was doing some contract work for the Browns scouting department, probably 6 or 7 years ago now. And I was looking at receivers. And on any single play of any game I was breaking down, I think I had somewhere between 25 and 30 different data points that I was entering in for every single receiver who I was studying, right? And so, what do you do with all that, though, as you start to get all these data points, as you look at, whether it's looking at film or some different physical attributes or measurements that you get from a player? I guess, for the coach today, why is that significant, and where do they start?
Yeah, really good question. Super curious who ended up at the top of your list.
I never knew what they did with the data. I was just the input guy. But I would say,
like 6 years ago, I almost would have made that list.
I had Sammy Watkins was in there, and I think DeAndre Hopkins.
Yeah.
And I know Brian Hartline was one I studied, and it was crazy because at the time all of the film was not high resolution, so it was literally, looking at who wears
you're looking at all 22 and you're trying
wristband,
to break down.
And it was trying to figure. You couldn't even see numbers on some of the film, so I was appreciative when I got to the Ohio State film. It was some high def film, and it helped me a lot, made it go easier. But I have no idea what they did with it. I could see and start to understand a little bit of why they would do that, but I never got to see the results of it.
Yeah, I guess you could say that the start is always kind of, what does a coach emphasize on the field, and what kind of athletes and players is he looking for? The best coaches, in my opinion, build their system around what talent they currently have available. The Bill Belichick's of the world, I can say Coach Kubiak and Shanahan, they build the system around what athletes and players they have. They don't expect, a skinny left tackle to be a north-south run, put his head down and smash people in the run game. They don't expect short little wide receivers to always play on the outside and jump over people and catch balls. And so they build their system around their players. So that's kind of where I always start is, what system do you coach? And the best thing that I've noticed about football, I played in a bunch. I don't think there is a wrong system. I think there's a wrong system for a player, but I don't think there's a wrong system. You talk about analytics and stuff like that. I think the failure is not realizing that people play all different styles of football and win. De La Salle, when I was in high school, still ran basically the wing tee and never lost. And so who are we to tell them that they should change because they should go run and shoot and 5 wide? They didn't have the players. They didn't have the system to support that. So I think the first step is what is your system? What are you coaching? What are you teaching? What are you preaching in there in the locker room to get your players to play hard and to emphasize what you're doing? So you start there, and then you start measuring what's important, in my opinion. And that's kind of where the analytics kicked in, right? If I'm asking Keith to break down film, then I would assume that I'm asking you to break down things that I find important, whether it's a receiver's ability to get off the line of scrimmage, create separation at the top of a route, catch balls in certain areas of the field, or contested balls in the red zone, whatever it is that our coach finds important. You would assume that maps back to the way they attack a defense, right? And so I think that's what you need to do, is make sure that all of the data and the analytics really map back to what you emphasize as a coaching staff. And then you can really drive deeper and deeper and deeper into some very individual and some very specific things about your players. And happy to talk about that, but I think it always starts that with culturally, are you measuring the things that are important? Because there's an old saying, like, not everything important can be measured, and not everything measured is important. And so, like, you got to make sure you get that right. Otherwise, what's the point, right? You can measure speed of your players in the open field, but if you play third grade soccer type football, you're never going to get it in the open field, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and there's, you mentioned some of those things, and I've been doing a series here, both on the podcast as well as writing some articles about it too, and understanding, the guys that you have, and it changes from year to year, especially, when you get into situations where you can't recruit. But even in some of those situations where you do recruit, understanding what you're trying to do, that, if you have a bunch of guys who are a little bit more, stout in their build and can roll their hips, but, aren't moving very well, you're probably looking up front at an offensive line that's going to go for more vertical distortion than it will horizontal. But as you mentioned, you have that, athletic, rangy tackle, that might be a guy that you reach and use to run, the outside zone or something to that effect. So the understanding of that begins to, I believe in what you're saying, here's the things we're looking for as far as measurables, and if we're going to be able to do this, right? And again, sometimes even when you do have those situations where you recruit, you might find out you're a little bit more suited to tweaking things and doing them a little bit different from year to year. Even though the basis might stay the same in the playbook, there might be a focus more one way, to a different part of the playbook, essentially.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, you hope that you can, what was the old phrase about, like, Miami back then? We don't recruit, we reload, or something like that. USC or Miami used to say that. Like, you hope that you can find players that were similar to the ones that just left. But that doesn't always happen, right? Whether, that young player felt intimidated, didn't want to go to that school, so he went to a different school, whether he knew there would be an opportunity or whatever it is. I just really think that's why people, when, sometimes they hear I'm talking data or analytics, they're like, oh, you're one of those people who thinks coaches are going to all be replaced by computers. That's not further from the truth. If anything, I think there's going to be a bigger emphasis on the EQ, the emotional aspect of motivating players and of coaching than ever before, because you're going to have a lot of information at your fingertips, and competing on X and O's is going to get more and more intellectual and harder, but you'll be able to still win just having guys that want to play hard. And I think a lot of coaches forget that, right? Is they either they lose a locker room, or they lose some key players that aren't practicing hard, and that's what's causing losses. It's not that they aren't diagramming good plays on Friday or Saturday.
Yeah, definitely. Well, in looking at this, and let's just take any particular position, and say we have a coach who wants to start to get involved in this, and in looking at his players and what some of that data is telling him, I guess, what's the starting point? And then, bridging that into kind of where you guys come into the play and some of the things that you're able to do, obviously, with your technology and your platform.
Sure. I'll give you a good example from June Jones and the XFL, because neither of them, I don't think, are employed right now. The XFL, when they were kicking back off last year, wanted to measure certain player attributes. They wanted to measure how good are these guys at playing football. We know they're not going to test well in the combine, so let's start measuring what they're good at, what makes them good at football. So then we go to June Jones and say, okay, June, what makes a receiver good? And he's like, it's their ability to stop and start. Great. So let's measure their ability to stop and start. So let's take a GPS device, something that a lot of college teams and a lot of high school teams have now, that's typically measuring load or, speed or, number of accelerations or whatever it is, and rip it and design a drill and have them run that drill with the device on, and then measure their ability to stop and start. And so for a receiver, all we did was have them run hitches, whip routes or twister routes or whatever you want to call those, deep overs, and crossing routes. right? And so we measured their ability to run those routes, their ability to stop and start, their ability to accelerate and to get open, right? And so then we racked and stacked their ability to do those and gave them back to the coaching staff, and that's how they drafted players. So if you think of that from an individual perspective, maybe that's not what you need out of your receivers. You're looking for something a little different. If you can find a device that's measuring something like that, that's when we come in, right? We're the data scientists and the nerds who work with raw data, but come at it from a football perspective and help you measure a drill, ideally something that you're already doing so you don't have to teach it. It's just, hey, receivers, we're running routes in practice today. You're just going to have this thing on your back. It's not like they're going to be like, oh, that's hard to do. They're just going to go run routes, and then you measure it after, and you're able to get a good idea of what these guys really do well and what makes them different than other receivers. And I think that's the key. And you do that. You can do that position by position, whether it's pad level for offensive linemen, whether it's your ability as a linebacker to drop and react, as a DB to turn your hips and run. Quarterback's the hardest position. There's some stuff you can do around them throwing the ball with a connected football and some footwork stuff. That's the hard, but that's more of a mental position than anything. But the other positions on the field, you can certainly measure the quality of their movements and what they do according to their position, and you can give back some good scores and not start to understand, are these guys well positioned, and if they are, how good are they?
We were talking about receivers. Does that kind of data apply in the box as well? I mean, we lived in an era where what was off-season development for, especially linemen, we threw them in the weight room, and that's what they got, right? They weren't out there throwing the ball around and, doing all those other things. Now we see a lot more training and development in the off-season. But where does that measurement come in for the guys who are playing on the line of scrimmage?
So for defensive line, we measured a defensive lineman's ability to get off the line of scrimmage, to get out of his 3-point stance, and how quickly and how much force he could hit a bag after completing like a half a loop. So we're basically trying to see how quickly he could get into an offensive lineman, and once he gets into an offensive lineman, how much force did he have, right? Because you don't want to favor skinny guys that just are fast and say, here's our best defensive end. And you don't want to favor fat guys that can just knock someone over. Ideally, it's somewhere in between. And maybe you don't have some guys in between, but you got to figure out what you have. So measuring something like that. Now, if you take that, you can turn that into a development plan. Maybe not just that one score, but you can turn a couple of those things into a development plan, saying like, okay, he does have amazing force at the point of contact, but he doesn't get off the ball that well. And he doesn't get off the ball that well on his left side as good as he on his right side. Well, let's take a look at that. Maybe he has some asymmetries in his legs. Maybe he has some issues with, turning his torso left or right. Let's really take a good look at him and develop a personalized and come up with a personalized development plan for this guy. That's my whole goal, really, is more personalized development for players. I think you see it every now and then in sports. Football is the best at it, and that we have a position coach per position, and they should have a personalized development plan. The problem is football is a really hard sport to measure because there's so much context that you don't have, right? I could be wide open, but if the offensive line didn't block, or the quarterback didn't see me, or the defensive end tipped the ball, I don't get it. So I don't get extra credit for being open even though I don't get the ball. So you really have to come up with creative ways to measure the game of football. The other sports are a little easier. Soccer, probably also difficult context-wise, but you can measure, how they create space. Basketball, a little bit easier because the ball's in play so much, and like if you're guarding the ball or have the ball in your hand, you can directly kind of quantify ability. But football, there's 10 guys doing really important stuff that never touch the ball, and how do you measure those things? And that's what we try to help teams understand.
So in projecting this ahead, we're already there in a lot of places. Even as you mentioned, at the high school level, we see teams, using some of the player tracking devices, et cetera. So that technology, as it scales, becomes more and more affordable. This isn't just a fad. It's not going to pass. So there is a future in understanding how this fits into what you do as a coach. Where do you see this going, and what do you think the timeline to get there is? And I have one more question I'll follow up after you answer those two.
Yeah, I think, you know what, the best part about what I always love about high school football is there's enough freedom to invent, and you could try new things. There's a lot of, like, I mean, we used to run the fly sweep in high school, and it took 9 years for that to make its way to the NFL. And so there's like plays and things that you do in the high school game that eventually make their way to the NFL. And then there's also technologies and player data and information that they get the benefit of waiting to come downstream. And just like you mentioned, a lot of that stuff is getting cheaper and better and faster and more and better quality. So the NFL and college is going to filter stuff out that eventually gets to high school that'll be a lot more usable. When you talk about personalized development plans, the NFL is going through this right now, right? Major League Baseball probably the best. There's guys like Trevor Bauer and all these guys who go get all this testing in the off season and are the best. Have 4, 5, 6, 7 years of data that follow them, and they knew how they've been developed. They're going to take that stuff and give it to college pitchers, and college pitchers are going to take that stuff and give it to high school pitchers. And so that's that information on how to properly develop and how to throw a fastball harder and how to keep your arm from falling off. Like that stuff is going to make its way down, similar to in basketball and also football as well. We'll have a lot of information on how DeAndre Hopkins played 15 years or how Tom Brady played looks like into this 46 years old or something. I don't know how that one we'll never figure out, but who knows? But you'll have this information on how to do things like that and eventually make its way to high school. So I think, wait a year, 2, 3, 4 years, there'll be some really interesting things to help high schools out. But I would certainly start with better understanding your system, what you're coaching, and codifying your system. And what that means is, like, what plays are you running? What type of athletes are you typically using? Well, really understanding yourself, because then when data and technology comes along, you can apply it better.
And so for that coach, I mean, you kind of got into it a little bit there, that coach who sees the value in this and that it is coming. I guess things he can do to prepare for it and even, start doing it maybe on a low budget basis right now.
Yeah. I think also what younger players and coaching staffs have the benefit of is a lot of these guys grew up playing Madden, and they inherently, you'd probably through osmosis, understand data and visualizations. Whereas, like, I was the last group that was kind of like, I didn't have a cell phone till I got to college. I remember it was still like 10 cents to send a text message, and my mom basically killed me after my sophomore year of college. But like that is gone. So now everyone is more of a digital native. They understand data. They understand information. So a lot of these kids can input things themselves. So there are things that kids can input about practice, input about their weight programs, input about their games, to allow you to even qualitatively start measuring things, and to start understand what it is you're asking these kids to do. The first thing I always tell people to understand from an athlete perspective is load. Load is, people typically say, how hard is your practice? That's load. The issue is, and this is my biggest kind of pet peeve with data science and sports science to date, is Michael Jordan played in every game. David Robinson played in every game. Hakeem, every game. And sports science hasn't told us that we can get these guys to play in more games more often. It's telling us to rest them. And I have an issue with that, because I do think overload is important to loading. So, like, to making sure your players are ready on Saturday doesn't always mean not practicing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Sometimes it means practicing even harder in order to allow their body to tear down so it can ultimately build back up again. So, like, really understanding player load and what your type of practices asks the body of your athletes to do is some interesting stuff on where to start. And you can do that qualitatively just through questionnaires. After practice, they could fill something out. They can get in the weight room and put some scores. Shoot, my old weight coach used to ask what my ZFL was for every day, my zest for life. Where did you land every day before practice and after practice? And you start looking at those trends, and then you map that back to how your practice was. You can really kind of start preparing yourself for data and whatnot. Like, oh, maybe I shouldn't use GPS devices on my offensive lineman on Thursday because it's their toughest day. I'll use it on receivers where it's their easiest day. We'll measure something interesting there. So you can always do some cool things to prepare yourself. But I think understanding what you practice, how you practice, and the effect that has on your athletes is a great place.
So I'm going to ask you the question I ask of all the coaches that I bring on this podcast. And, when you look at, you've been there, you've played for good coaches. You now are in the sports science and the data, all these numbers kinds of things. We look at football in general. What's the one thing you feel, regardless of all those things, that really gives guys the winning edge? What is it that is the winning edge in football?
I never won as a team, I think, which is one of my biggest regrets kind of in life, because I'll never be part of a football team again. In high school, I lost in the semifinals of state. In college, we won the Mountain West, but we didn't win our bowl game. We weren't national champions by any means at Colorado State. In the NFL, I played in one playoff game, and it certainly wasn't from a lack of effort on my part or whatnot. So it's tough to say, like, individually, what is it that separates you and helps you win, which is why I think football is such an amazing sport, right? In soccer, you can have one guy that changes the game. Same with basketball. In football, you really can't. Maybe you can with a quarterback, but he still needs a lot of guys around him. I would say the collective effort, when you can get that right, you have something special, because you can still outwork teams. You can still grind them down on a field. And that's the part of the game I always loved, was like, you know what, there'll be times when you're more talented or less talented, and you're just going to lose no matter how well you practice or whatnot. And that's the case. But you know what, that's them's the breaks. But when talent is close enough, you can grind out a team and beat them. And I think that's just something that I think coaches, what is the winning edge? It's just the willingness to grind and the willingness to work. And when you can motivate your players to do that and keep them focused and get them to collectively work and grind, I think you can do some special things.
It's great stuff that you share with us here today. I think we're only scratching the surface on this, and I certainly would love to pick the conversation back up with you again in the future. Where can our listeners learn more about you and what you do?
Hey, you can hit me up on Twitter anytime, David Anderson 89. At David Anderson 89. You can look us up, breakawaydata.com, LinkedIn, all those things. I'm always interested in hearing from coaches, how we can help with small, discrete problems. We have big things that we can do for coaches, but we're really trying to help, professional college and high school coaches better understand and use data, because I think the more the merrier, in our opinion. Once a lot of cool things are invented in the high school space, like I was mentioning, so we're all ears, and we can figure out a price point that works for anyone. I mean, we're excited to be in ball, and I'll be a lifer, so you don't have to worry about that.
Well, it was great catching up with you here, and again, love to hear more from what you guys are doing in the future.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
Thank you again for listening to the Coaching Coordinator Podcast. Please, if you are enjoying the podcast, head over to iTunes or Spotify and click 5-star for a rate. If you have a minute, write a review. It really helps the podcast. Check out our new home for the Coaching Coordinator Podcast. That's at coachandcoordinator.com. And follow me on Twitter at Coach K. Grabowski.